Welcome to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are joined today by Jerome Horton. He is the chair of California's Board of Equalization. Later on the program, we'll be joined by his wife. Her name is Yvonne Horton. She is the city clerk for the city of Inglewood, talking about an upcoming women's conference. But first, we start with Mr. Horton. I want to speak with you about the state of California and its fiscal house.
Yes.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I guess our budget is balanced?
It is balanced.
It is
well,
balanced.
you know, it's required by law to be balanced,
well,
but this time it's actually balanced.
Right.
You know,
how did that happen?
Well, I think the increase in sales tax has caused it to be balanced. The voters passed an initiative to increase the sales tax. That was helpful to the tune of about $1.4 billion. And then we're anticipating an increase in property taxes, increase in personal income tax, and an increase in sales tax overall, to somewhere around $177 billion. The state will take in this year.
Right.
That's what we're anticipating.
But the question becomes, if Prop 30 didn't pass, would we have been in this situation, or was the improving economy the reason why we're in this improved situation, or both?
I think it's a combination of both, Brad. The economy is improving. It is getting better. The challenge we face as a state is that we've got a $94 billion fund balance, meaning over the last 10 years with these deficits, they keep adding up, debt. So we got $94 billion in debt, somewhere around 40-some billion dollars in bond financing that we have to cover and take care of. We have to have a surplus, an ongoing surplus, for at least 5 to 6 years before we can balance that fund balance.
And let's talk about bonding, because California voters, for better or for worse, have been very generous as it relates to bonds. And like you said, we do have some significant bond debt. What's interesting is some of that bond debt has actually gone to market, other has not.
Right.
And so we're paying interest on bonds we haven't even issued.
We haven't even issued, and that's the $42 billion in bonds.
Right.
Yeah, $42 billion sitting out there. You haven't issued, you're not using, but yet still you're paying interest on it. That's a challenge. And our deficit over the years is presented the challenge because the bonds haven't been rated high enough to be of interest to investors. And so therein is part of the challenge.
So where do we go on this question of indebtedness? We know, for example, that in addition to the bonds, we have the teachers union asking that the money that was borrowed from schools over the last few years to balance the budget, that be paid back. And so we have a lot of obligations that are being called to roost. How do we handle those in this time of being in the black?
Well, I think we have to be careful. We are anticipating a $5 billion surplus, but there are a couple things we have to do, Brad. I believe that we have to strengthen up the weakest link. So I would be supportive of the teachers and trying to make sure that we're educating, because it's important that we build a solid, strong customer base.
And it's interesting you mention teachers, children education, because what the governor has indicated as part of his May revise, that's the budget he recently released, is that he wants the additional revenues to go to essentially education exclusively.
Right.
And on the one hand, that may feel good, but is that the best approach?
Well, there are two revenue sources, which I don't think has been discussed. One is the revenue source going towards education. By law, Proposition 98, a significant funding is going to education whether we want to or not. The question is, do you pay up the arrears? Do you catch up the arrears? The money you took away from education, do you give it back? The other debate is investing in social programs. Should you invest in social programs?
And I want to ask you about that because, for example, Darrell Steinberg, he is the Senate Pro Tem. What he has said is that while he's pleased to see additional money move into schools, there were such draconian cuts in social service programs over the last few years. Should we not consider trying to at least fill the gap back and create a situation where we can at least restore some of the cuts made in social services over the last few years?
I would agree with Senator Steinberg, but I think there are other ways, is that our policies have to match our purpose. If our purpose is to generate more jobs, generate more income, we can look at tax reform, the regulatory process reform, in order to do that. there are a number of reforms that we can put in place that will actually stimulate the economy without incurring additional debt as far as the revenue generating. And so that's where I think the legislature can help out. And by making it easier to create a job here in California, and I know it sounds a little weird, but
look, we've talked about regulatory reform, and it appears that both Democrats and Republicans in 2013 are supportive of regulatory reform.
We're headed in that direction.
The question becomes, will it truly happen? For example, we look at CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act.
Right.
A lot of hue and cry about CEQA and how it's used as a weapon and not to really keep California clean and green. The governor has called for CEQA reform. But what we've seen lately is not so much CEQA reform in a broad sense, but let's have CEQA reform for a football stadium, let's have CEQA reform for the bullet train, not these comprehensive types of reforms that some would argue are necessary.
Well, I mean, it's incremental reform, and then there's broad-based reform. But I think the challenge before the government is the lack of the intellectual capacity to actually get the job done. We have to bring together the best and the brightest, study the best policies, identify the solutions to these problems, and then begin to implement them on a broad-based, long-term, strategic way. We can't do this incrementally. That was the mistakes that we made in the past. And as you know, I think there was someone that said insanity is doing the same thing, expecting different results.
No, there's no doubt about that. But is there that political will? I mean, look, I know you're on the Board of Equalization. You're not a member of the legislature, but you do have a bully pulpit.
Right.
And so do you sense that, you know, in these better times, when we're not trying to put a Band-Aid on so many different leaks, that now is the time to really look at trying to restructure? It could be our tax code. I mean, look, on the tax code, you're the expert.
Right.
We rely, as I'm told, way too much on personal income tax.
Right.
Way too much.
We do.
And the bust and boom cycles are killing the state.
They are.
Is that something that should be evaluated?
I think it should, but at the Board of Equalization, we're also looking at increasing our efficiency and effectiveness, making it easier to start a business, and for those that are in business, teaching them how to capitalize on the existing tax credits. There are enough taxes out there, enough credits out there, but many people aren't capitalizing on it.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because we hear a lot about California being business unfriendly, but if you really dig deep into...
California is very business friendly.
Especially on the question of tax credits and R&D credits.
Exactly.
Regulatory reform, that's a whole other question. But if you look at kind of just raw taxes, we're kind of in the middle when compared to our sister states.
I mean, you're talking about billions of dollars in tax credits. But the interesting thing, Brad, is that the Franchise Tax Board of Equalization, we're holding somewhere around $200–300 million in refunds that people haven't even applied for.
Why?
They just haven't applied. These are individuals who feel that they don't have to file their tax returns, and so they're not filing, they're not applying. Just as a way of example of how we can put money back into the economy, just by being more efficient, more effective at what we do.
Well, we've talked countless times about the earned income tax credit.
Oh, that's huge.
And huge. One needs to apply to receive it?
Individuals making $51,000 and below, they're entitled to it. $1.5 billion goes uncollected every year. That's a huge amount of money. This year, we were able to generate somewhere around $7 million back into the economy through the VITA program. But these are just examples. On the regulatory side, we can change some of the regulations as it relates to CEQA and so forth.
Do anything on regulatory reform?
We are, and we can, and we are. We're looking at this thing called the underground economy, which you and I talked about often, but we're trying to change the policies as it relates to that to make us more effective and efficient as a government. We're implementing, we're supporting tax credits that we believe will stimulate the economy. We're supporting smart tax credits, as we talked about before, the interesting one about exempting pet medicine and so forth and so on.
There are a lot of different ways the board can work. Okay, his name is Jerome Horton. He is the chairman of California's Board of Equalization. When we come back, we'll be joined by Yvonne Horton. She is the city clerk for the city of Inglewood. She is Mr. Horton's better half, and we'll be speaking about a women's conference coming up in Southern California. I'm Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition.
How much money does California's Board of Equalization collect in taxes and fees annually? More than $25 billion? $50 billion, $65 billion, or more than $80 billion. Every year, California's Board of Equalization collects more than $50 billion in taxes and fees supporting state and local government services.
Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are now joined by Yvonne Horton. She is clearly Chairman Horton's better half. She is the city clerk for the city of Inglewood. Of course, Jerome Horton is the chair of California's Board of Equalization. Yvonne, thank you for joining us on the program. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to speak about an upcoming conference. Okay. It is called the Connecting Women to Power Business Conference. It's June 28th at Cal State Dominguez Hills. What inspired you to start this conference, to be the driving force behind it?
Well, I was inspired and encouraged by the women's conference that Maria Shriver and Arnold Schwarzenegger put on, and I enjoyed the conference so well that I encouraged Jerome to join.
Encouraged or forced?
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both, right?
To put on a conference for women in business.
And let's talk about that, because there's no doubt that while women are making strides, there are still challenges. It's interesting, just this morning I heard a report that women are now 6 in 10 college graduates, which is remarkable, meaning new college graduates.
Right.
But yet they're still making less than their male counterparts. Still, which is surprising in a lot of ways. So let's talk about the aims behind the conference. What are your hopes and dreams for the conference, June 20th, Cal State Dominguez Hills?
Well, a couple of things. I'm hoping that women will want to start their own business, because a lot of women are still executive moms, as I was, and still am.
Right.
And we have to function in terms of taking care of our home and working in the business. And so I found that a lot of women were successful with home businesses. And so, yes, and working from home and taking care of their home responsibilities. So,
Sir Chairman Horton, tell me what you see in terms of women in the workforce.
Well, you know, the other things, in addition to life balance skills and so forth, we want to provide the strategies for success. How do you break through this glass ceiling? As Yvonne has indicated, how do you start your own business? Why work for someone else? Why not start your own business? Use the expertise that you have.
And it's interesting you say that, because I just notice, I have 2 daughters, they're preteens, and for better or for worse, when you're in a social situation, adults will talk to boys different than girls.
They do.
They'll talk to them about business, or they talk to girls about soccer or movies or whatever it is. At least they're talking about sports, but still, we still haven't changed the way we interact with our daughters. Do you agree,
yes.
City Clerk?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate in a lot of ways. Now, you talked about the glass ceiling, and we've seen a lot of cracks in that ceiling. I have to say that Southern California must be particularly proud that one of those cracks was made by our very own Hilda Solis.
Yes.
She was a member of the United States Congress. She recently stepped down after a 4-year run as the Secretary of Labor in Washington, D.C., and she is going to be attending what on June 28th?
She's going to be attending the conference. She's a keynote speaker.
She's the keynote
speaker. And she'll be bringing all of this stuff about, she's broken through all these different glass ceilings. She has a sense of it on the national level as well as the local level and the state level. So I think we'll get some rich insights, rich key points.
And I also, if I may, I want to talk about women of color and really folks of color, because what people may not realize is, sir, you have broken through a glass ceiling.
I have.
In terms of ethnicity. You are the highest ranking African-American constitutional officer.
Well, there's 2 of us now.
There's 2. You
and
Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you were elected before Kamala.
But I was the first African-American to be elected to the Board of Equalization since its inception.
Right.
But the interesting thing about color, Brad, we all, unless we're invisible, we all have a color.
No, which is well stated. Which is well stated. But that being said, I know that we still, attention needs to be paid to communities of color. We talk about how we talk to our daughters. It's also how we talk to students of color. You know, for better or for worse, we're still not there yet.
Yeah, we're not.
And so talk to us about how you hope to reach women of color at the conference.
Well, I would like for them to be encouraged to come out. Part of the process in the conference is we have a main session where we all come together, and then we have breakout sessions, and we talk about different things, different businesses. I think there's one that you talk about tax.
Starting your own business, how to start your own business, and then the work-life balance.
And then that's the one that I'm going to be facilitating.
Work-life balance.
Yes, and I'm really excited about that because we have so many responsibilities to juggle, and I know because I called myself the executive mom, and that was school teacher, chauffeur, cook. And although
you had been a school teacher.
No, but I am when I'm teaching my kids their homework.
Of course, no, of course, of course. I
so I give myself all these titles.
I do want to ask you though about a new trend. You know, as I said, I have daughters, preteens. I meet a lot of Mr. Moms.
Yes,
I do meet a lot of Mr. Moms, and they're wonderful people, of course. But that means, you know, their wives are the primary, they're the breadwinners of the family. And so is that something that you're addressing in this conference, this shift where moms are the primary breadwinners?
You know, I think we will, now that you brought that up, because that was not one of them.
So you brought, I actually thought of something smart.
But the interesting, if I may, Yvonne, the interesting thing about the work-life balance is it talks about the need for that partnership between your spouse, you, and your children, in order so regardless of where you are in the scheme of things, whether you're there working or you're at home, that's a partnership. And that partnership.
I remember a few months ago, I was speaking with a member of the Board of Supervisors in San Bernardino County. And she has two young children. Her name is Janice Rutherford, 5 and 3. And I said to her, how are you able to balance this? How are you able to do this? And after the interview, I said to myself, if her name was Mr. Rutherford, I wouldn't have asked her that.
Yeah.
So even I, who think that I'm enlightened, we still have these biases. You know, that why is it any different? You know, if it was a dad, I wouldn't have asked. And so tell me more about this work-life balance that's going to be discussed at the conference.
Well, some women take their, and some elected women, and I can't remember the lady's name, but she was on Good Morning America, and she was in Congress, and she had her son
while
at
a member
meeting,
of and
her son threw up on her, and she still had to stay to vote. And so we need to talk about issues like that if you have to bring your kids to work. I mean, most people wouldn't even think that she would have her kid there, but she did. And we need to talk about when do you know how to cut off from work. As me being the city clerk for the city of Inglewood, and we're in election season, now we're in a runoff, it consumes a lot of time. Sometimes we're there 15 to 18 hours. So how do you leave enough energy for your family when you get home?
Well, that's when I become dad, mom.
I was going to say,
he does a good job.
But what's interesting too is technology being omnipresent. I have a very difficult time turning it off when I get home. Very difficult. My parents did not, because they didn't have the option to keep it going. And so it can be a real challenge.
As Yvonne has said on a number of occasions, we have to have some me time, some we time, and some together time. We really have to separate that.
How can we attend the conference? How do we attend?
Oh,
is there a cost? Do we show up? Do we sign up?
It's free.
It's free is good.
It's free. Free is good. And all you have to do is go to the Board of Equalization website, click onto my website, and then there'll be a little button that'll say something about the Women's Conference. We encourage folks to go and register.
So it's best to register.
We're anticipating somewhere around 3,500 businesses to register, and then we're going to shut it off because we just don't have the capacity to address the total need. So and we're excited about it.
I mean, I think it's going to be a huge networking opportunity.
And a lot of energy.
And how does it make you feel that you're able to be a voice for working women?
I love it. I would like to expand outside of the conference and have more workshops for women, because we definitely need the support from each other and we need new ideas.
I hear you. Her name is Yvonne Horton. She is the city clerk for Inglewood. His name is Jerome Horton. He is the chair of the Board of Equalization. The upcoming Connecting Women to Power Business Conference will be held on June 28th at Cal State Dominguez Hills. Go to the BOE website and find Mr. Horton's page and you can sign up. I'm Brad Pomerance. This is Charter California Edition.
In what state is gender income inequality the greatest? Louisiana, Utah, West Virginia, or Wyoming? According to the Census Bureau, women in Utah have it the worst. There, the average working woman makes 55 cents for every dollar than the average working man.
Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are joined by Ariel Roddy. She recently graduated from Scripps College, a women's college in the Inland Empire, and she wrote a thesis entitled Price, Policy, and Purchasing: The Effects of Enforcement on Marijuana Consumption. I was fascinated by the thesis, in large part because, as you may know, the California Supreme Court recently issued a ruling that dealt with zoning laws and whether cities could exclude medical marijuana clinics. And they said on a 7-0 decision, yes. I know your thesis, though, talked more about marijuana generally and its possession, not so much about medical marijuana, but let's talk about it because marijuana is in the news. How did you come to decide to write a thesis on marijuana possession?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always been very interested in addiction studies from a number of different angles. I think that it's mostly explored from a public health standpoint.
Sure.
I think it's also explored from a psychological standpoint. But most of my interests are in the reign of economics, and I'm really interested to see how economics plays a role in the decisions of people who are addicted or are struggling with addiction.
Right.
And I think that marijuana is also, I mean, it's really up and coming. It's also a very accessible drug. So I was really interested to see how enforcement kind of played a role in the decision making that people had.
And it's interesting you mentioned enforcement because there's no doubt that there are so many conflicting signals on enforcement. You have Washington and Colorado legalizing it.
Right.
You have California with a medical marijuana ordinance. At the same time, you have a federal government that sometimes tries to enforce its ban on the use of marijuana, period, even in California. So I'm complicating the subject even further. But let's talk about your thesis.
Absolutely.
I know you were looking at 3 specific areas. Let's kind of start with the first.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said in my senior thesis, I examined 3 specific relationships.
Right.
So the first relationship that I was interested was in the relationship between enforcement. So when I say enforcement, what I'm speaking of specifically is the marijuana arrest rate.
Yes.
So I'm looking at the relationship between the marijuana arrest rate and then the street price of marijuana. So I wanted to see if any enforcement measures were going to change the price of marijuana on the street. And yeah, my results did reveal that an increase in enforcement did result in a slight increase in the street price of marijuana.
Only slight, though.
Right. I think around 50 cents per pure ounce of marijuana.
Which I think isn't a lot.
No, it's not a lot.
So what does that tell you? Or what did that tell you?
Yeah, so I think what it tells us kind of in the grander scheme of things is that these enforcement measures, although they did result in an increase in the price, they're not necessarily doing very much in terms of actually curbing the use of individuals who began to sell.
And I understand that you looked at 5 different zones throughout the country.
Yes.
Was there any distinction between geographic zones?
Yeah, there was absolutely a distinction, yes. And I think a lot of that had to do with the accessibility of marijuana in specific regions of the country. So kind of as you would assume, enforcement in California would have a very different effect than it would in a rural setting or perhaps in a central region, just because marijuana is much more accessible in here than it is
it fair to say that in rural areas where marijuana may not be so accessible, enforcement would increase the price more than on the coast, for example, where marijuana can come through Mexico or is grown everywhere.
Exactly,
in
because there are fewer suppliers, obviously, in rural regions.
So what was the second part of your thesis?
The second part of my thesis involved the relationship between the price of marijuana and whether or not individuals curbed their consumption.
Interesting. And so what did you find? Was there like a break point?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a very interesting distinction between rural and non-rural settings.
Right.
So in rural settings, what I found was actually that as the price increased, individuals tend to increase their use.
Increase?
Yeah, I know. How counterintuitive.
And is that because it becomes more alluring?
I mean, that could be true, but I think more or less that one of the shortcomings of my research is that I can't necessarily prove any causality between the two things that I'm examining. So one doesn't necessarily influence the other directly.
Okay.
I think just in the way that I did my analysis, it was difficult to know exactly whether price was influencing influencing consumption, or maybe consumption was influencing price. So as individuals began to increase consumption.
Supply and demand.
Exactly, supply and demand.
What about in non-rural settings?
In non-rural settings, actually, as the price increased, consumption decreased.
Huh.
I know, how fascinating.
Yeah.
But these were both very marginal effects. They weren't very substantial, they weren't huge, but they were significant, and they did exist.
Statistically significant.
Statistically significant, exactly.
Third part of your thesis.
Third part of my thesis, and this is kind of the crux of my interest, was to see whether or not the marijuana arrest rate, an increase in the marijuana arrest rate, had any influence over individuals using. So if they would be affected by seeing an increase in use, would they curb their consumption? And there was definitely an effect. So as the enforcement increased in these specific areas, individuals used less.
What's interesting, though, in California, we essentially have decriminalized marijuana use.
Right.
I mean, unless you're selling, you're going to get a ticket, which to me is just so odd to think. I mean, I know people who've been pulled over. They have marijuana in their possession. They get a ticket. I mean, it's worse. DWI is worse.
Right. Right.
And so, okay, so let's step back for a second.
Yes, absolutely.
What does this tell you? You know, we have this whole notion, you know, you probably don't remember because you probably weren't born, but this whole Nancy Reagan just say no to drugs. And that continues at some level to be part of the zeitgeist in our culture. But at the same time, I mean, I was looking at some research. I mean, there are 18 states with medical marijuana laws. 3 states that are considering medical marijuana laws.
Right.
You know, as I said, Colorado and Washington have legalized it. Alaska is considering legalizing it. I mean, we're getting to a point where is prohibition just a big fat failure?
Yeah, and that's a really complicated question.
Oh, come on, you know everything. I can tell. I mean, you're a genius on this subject.
No, I mean, I can't tell you everything. Of course. But using the research that I've conducted, I think what we can kind of tell is that there is, in fact, a direct relationship between enforcement and consumption, and that individuals do respond to it. But specifically, from the results that I received, the system looks a little inefficient. Specifically because in order to increase, and that's what I discovered. To increase enforcement, it requires a lot of reallocation of resources in enforcement.
So while there is some causal relationship, arguably, between enforcement and decreasing rates, if you really wanted to plummet rates, you have to really send up that enforcement level.
Exactly, and that would mean substituting policemen away from maybe enforcing, you know, like violent crimes, so trying to stop violent crimes, and then focusing more on trying to incarcerate individuals who are smoking, you know, marijuana, and that feels a little problematic.
Did you, in your research, were you able to determine whether resources were going toward marijuana enforcement or away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the specific time period that I was interested in was a little bit after, as you said, the war on drugs.
Right.
Yeah. So it was after one of the first ordinances, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum sentences for individuals who were caught with possession.
Right.
And so this was kind of during a time where the war on drugs was gaining a lot of political teeth.
Right.
So I specifically chose that time frame just to kind of see whether or not these specific ordinances were having an effect on the people who were consuming.
And so if you were to do part 2 of your thesis, I understand that you may be getting a PhD, God willing, what would you want to figure out next? Is there a part 4, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that because the political climate is changing so much, you know, I would love to kind of maybe extend my thesis to a broader time frame and maybe look at specific ordinances that are going on right now. So I would love to investigate kind of the role that medical marijuana is playing kind of in the market of consumption for individuals who would use anyway.
And I wonder what happens in Washington and Colorado.
That's yet to be seen.
They have legalized, yet you still have a federal government who says it's a Schedule I drug or whatever it may be. And you also have President Obama and his administration and senators from Vermont or wherever saying, maybe we should look at this. Maybe we should allow states to resolve. So I wish you the very best. Congratulations on your graduation from Scripps College. She is Ariel Roddy. She recently wrote the thesis called Price, Policy and Purchasing, the Effects of Enforcement on Marijuana Consumption. I'm Brad Pomerance. This is Charter California Edition.